Now we're going to move to Triton data agreement. Kevin?
There was some questions submitted on this. I did, as I stated previously, our district attorney did go through this with us, and that's those are the changes submitted both by Triton's attorney, and then you see some additional strikes and comments. Those are from our attorney. There were some questions submitted by Mr. Walsh in regards to some things being confusing and not being as specific. I want to go into a little more detail with this. The overall agreement was laid out to about 30 to 35 schools. It's for all of the feeders, for all the high schools that Triton supports, as well as all their feeder elementary schools. So what Triton wanted to do in the discussions that occurred between superintendents and Triton were to establish a general agreement that would protect both sides so that they could share data back and forth on how the course sequences kids and how kids were performing K through 12, and then how they did when they took classes at Triton, and vice versa. Triton could share back with schools on how kids, on the kids' success rate once they started taking college level courses based on their courses of study in the through the K-12 system. There was a question about the purpose of study and not being as specific. After speaking with the attorney, after receiving the questions, the attorney said basically under the FERPA and the Student Records Act, the only way that you're really allowed to share this kind of data is it's for a study between educational institutions. So that's why they refer to it as a study and a scope of a project. The primary purpose is the data sharing for the schools to then use the data how they want to use it to conduct studies at their buildings. The one change that was identified that I did end up putting in was in one of the examples, that section 7.2, where it gets a little confusing about the confidential information that's going to be considered sensitive and should not be tightly controlled. I did add personally identifiable information. That was a suggestion we received, and that the attorney felt that was a good suggestion. But those were just examples. Even though we're not releasing some of that information, those were just examples that they unfortunately provided, so it made it a little more confusing. Overall, I think we should approve this contract or this agreement. We can terminate at any time that either side feels. It does help us kind of track performance data and how our students are doing, especially since we've been starting to look at, and Pam can speak to this a little more, based on our ACT scores, and then the students that we feel are how they're scoring at the high school level are still sometimes being placed in remedial classes when they go to the junior college level. So that would be an example of how we can share information back and forth between the two organizations. Pam, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, we're trying to link up closer by having, I believe I spoke to the board the last time about how the kids were taking the compass test here. On February 4th, they took the test so that they are aware, the students that are in our college algebra, they're seniors, how much they need to really buckle down and continue to study so that they can bring their scores up in order to not get into those remedial classes at Triton. So I think that we're trying to collaborate with them and work with them so that we can tighten the linkage between. It would be helpful for us to get data from them on how our students do when they are placed in those remedial classes, or how they do when they're placed in the regular classes if they're struggling. We are aware that Triton has the score that they expect on the compass is about an equivalent to a 22 or 23 on the ACT in the math, which would get you into a regular level class at a lot of the state universities. But they're pretty tough, the community colleges, because they find that the students don't do as well. So it is good for us to share data. This has been a long discussion that we've had, and we think that it will be beneficial to us to help us tighten up what we're doing here so our kids transfer in with the skills they need to be successful.
And I think there was one other question about, like, should there be a minimum of schools participate or maximum? So just to clarify again, it's more or less a general agreement, and then how we want to share the data back and forth with Triton. We wouldn't be sharing it with the other schools involved in the study necessarily, just Triton providing us specific information and us providing Triton specific information. I know that was one of the questions.
Well, let me just, first of all, I have a fundamental problem with how our contracts are drafted, and we keep hearing the attorney review them. Everything you said sounds good. They don't have to do anything you said before this agreement. So we're gonna take the time to gather data. It doesn't even say what years, so we're gonna go back. It says alumni in some places. We don't know what years we're gonna give. We don't know how long we're gonna do it. We have some limitation on it. We're gonna send it to them, which has a risk, because it's confidential information. If they get breached, we've got issues we have to deal with. In exchange, this all sounds good, and they don't have to do anything. There's not one mention in there of what specifically they're gonna do, when they're gonna give you a report, how the report's going to be. So, you know, again, you have this touchy-feely, I don't see the great value of entering. There's a little thing on protecting the data and confidentiality, but we're gonna gather it, we're gonna send it to them, and if they never send one piece of data back to us, they're not breaching the agreement. Yes, we can cancel it, but why did we go to the trouble to gather the data? In my mind, if you're getting into this kind of agreement, or any kind of agreement, it should lay out what you're gonna get in exchange, and it doesn't. And if, you know, if you're comfortable doing it that way, I'm not gonna I'm gonna not say don't do it, but what you just said they're going to do, they don't have to do any of that.
Right, and I just want to clarify too, though, we're not required to release it either. If they ask for data, it's not like we're breaching it. What this agreement allows us to do is if we want to provide that data, we can share it. So it's not like we're binded to have to provide the data. It's kind of like if you look at the first, it's as the term set, maybe as a term set forth. So it's very general. I don't think it's something that where we break in a contract if we don't give them the student data.
I don't think you would either.
So that's why I
don't think you're gonna
I
actually-
think they're asking us for something unreasonable, and I asked the building to do it. We could easily say that's a lot to pull, and for something we don't know what we're. I think what this is setting up in place so that if we want to start sharing data, we can.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments on this? All right, seeing none, we're going to be bringing this up at the Committee of the Whole meeting on February 25th for adoption.